Julie Suk, it's so great to be talking with you today about your new book. Congratulations. It's
Thank you.
terrific. I mean, one of the things that's so beautiful about your book is that the way the ERA story is told is usually Abigail Adams, Alice Paul, the 70s, and now 2017. But what you've done is fill in the gaps. Talk to us about how you approached the story of the ERA and how you started when you did.
So I've been writing about the ERA for about, I'd say, the last decade or so. And as a legal scholar, my emphasis was often on what the ERA would achieve if it became law, how it might change things. And when I started writing this book, I really pivoted from the what question to the who question. Who has been making the ERA? And the very important topic of women as constitution makers. Because the goal in this book was to understand what the ERA will do through the lens of who was making it happen. And I think it's so important. My hope is that Americans will read this book and familiarize themselves with the history that will make them take seriously the possibility of women as constitution makers and women as founding mothers. The fact that the US actually does have founding mothers of the Constitution, and that we should be taking them as seriously as we take our founding fathers.
So talk to us a little bit about the founding mothers. Then I want to it's a big jump. I want to go to the 1940s because that's such an interesting time. But the founding mothers, who do you put in that category?
So when I think about founding mothers, I think about women as constitution makers and as lawmakers. And it's very interesting because right now we're on the cusp of the 19th Amendment centennial. And we think about a lot of the suffragists who were activists. And they made law, but only indirectly, because there was only one woman in Congress who actually ever voted on the suffrage amendment. And she was actually not even in Congress by the time that Congress voted to send out the amendment, the 19th Amendment, to the states. So the ERA is really the only amendment that was actually written by women, introduced by women in Congress, ratified by state legislatures that had women in them, and actually the ratification being led in the 21st century with the 3 states that ratified in recent years, really the ratification led by women lawmakers. And I guess that's what I mean, that they're actually women with lawmaking power.
And women of color lawmakers at that.
Absolutely. And that's also a part of the ERA's history that I think is either unknown or sometimes forgotten or invisible, that since the 1970s, women of color have played such a leading role, not just in moving it forward politically, but giving it meaning through their words on the floor of Congress, in testimony before congressional hearings, committee hearings, and certainly on the floor of state legislatures in recent years that have ratified. And I think that's so important.
But even before this, talk to us a little bit about Patsy Mink and about Pauli Murray. They're names that do not often get brought up when we're talking about the ERA.
Absolutely. So Patsy Mink she was an Asian American woman from Hawaii, Japanese American, and her family had been through the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. She was the first woman of color to be elected to Congress in 1964, followed shortly thereafter by Shirley Chisholm, the first African-American woman to be elected. And Patsy Mink really championed the cause of the ERA. She gave very fierce speeches on the floor of Congress in 1970, because really in 1970 is, I would say, when the ERA gets made, the modern ERA, because Martha Griffiths gets it to the floor of Congress. By a discharge petition, and it gets passed by an overwhelming majority in the House. So Patsy Mink really talked a lot about the importance of the ERA in outlawing sex discrimination. And she had a very robust vision of what that meant. It didn't just mean that they would get rid of sex distinctions in the law. It also meant that it would really encourage Congress and state legislatures to take proactive steps to get rid of things that actually disadvantaged women. And so for someone like Patsy Mink, the fact that she was actually working on childcare legislation at the same time that she was advocating for the ERA, she was advocating for Title IX, and in fact has become known as the mother of Title IX. In 2002, Title IX was actually renamed the Patsy Mink statute.
Right.
And
And Pauli Murray, talk to us about her. She was a genius, did so many things, not only a lawyer and a friend of Eleanor Roosevelt, et cetera, but an ERA proponent.
She was. So Pauli Murray, before she started advocating for the ERA, she gave testimony in 1970 during Senate hearings, Judiciary Committee hearings on the ERA. And what she said about the ERA was very powerful because, of course, back in the 1940s and 50s, not all women and not all feminists were united behind the cause of the ERA. There were questions about what it would actually do. And one of the things Pauli Murray did was devise what's known as the dual strategy. The dual strategy meaning they were going to advocate for women's rights and the prohibition of sex discrimination under the 14th Amendment, which they already had, and under which they were already building a very robust civil rights agenda, and with some success. But she thought that we could use the 14th Amendment to protect women's rights, but also independently advocate for an ERA. So that was the dual strategy. And what's really amazing is that when she testified in 1970 about the ERA, she said, well, there are a lot of things that we can do using the 14th Amendment, but she had this new hope for the ERA, where the ERA would actually encourage lawmakers to be more creative about solutions to the problem of unequal power. Not just the law making distinctions between men and women, which was one manifestation of unequal power, but really things like the fact that there was a dangerous imbalance with regard to power in institutions like Congress. I mean, the ERA when the ERA was first passed by the House, even by an overwhelming majority, there were only 10 women in Congress at the time.
Right.
That's 2%.
2%. We're a little better now.
And Pauli Murray. Well, she said in her testimony. She said in her testimony that if you had less than a third of women in Congress, that would be a dangerous imbalance. And Pauli Murray was a brilliant constitutional law scholar, as well as a lawyer. And so she knew, I mean, I think the 1/3 is not a random number. Under Article 5 of the Constitution, you need 2/3 of Congress to get a constitutional amendment passed, 2/3 of both houses. And so if you have less than 1/3 of women in Congress, women don't even have the power to block an amendment, let alone pass one. Of course, women have always made coalitions, but if you have fewer than 1/3 in Congress, men in Congress could actually pass an amendment without ever talking to a female colleague. And that's actually a very dangerous situation for democracy. And she really called that out in her 1970 testimony. So the ERA was not only about what it would do as law, but what it would signal in terms of women having some political power and political influence.
Yeah, a prescient woman of color, a Black woman who was very insightful and a participant in the effort. I gave a talk recently, and someone posed the question, well, what would you say to Alice Paul? If Alice Paul were here today, what would you say to her? And I'm going to pass that question on to you. Considered, the creator, although in your book you have given us so many women before and after, a really huge body, an army of women working to create this ERA. What would you say to Alice Paul in 2020 about what she started almost a century ago, or was a part of a century ago?
Well, I think I would first congratulate Alice Paul for her persistence and devotion to the Equal Rights Amendment as a cause. And I think also, if I could do so in a manner that's respectful, I would also point out, though, the ways in which I think historically her single-minded commitment to this amendment in some ways undermine some of the coalitions that were needed to ultimately pass it across the generations. So I think one of the criticisms that you see of Alice Paul that emerges later on is her attitude with regard to race. during the suffrage amendment. And I think this is a story that gets told both in my book, but also in a lot of other women historians' work, including Martha Jones' work, that Mary Church Terrell, who worked with Alice Paul. And one thing that's so interesting is that when Alice Paul organized the huge attention-grabbing suffrage parade in 1913, there was a little bit of a dispute about whether African-American women would participate on equal terms. Mary Church Terrell had formed an African-American sorority at Howard University, and they marched towards the back of the parade in part because they were worried about the coalition of Southern women participating in that parade. And it wasn't only the race issue. I think there's also some evidence in the historical record that Alice Paul was also very careful about allowing concerns about birth control and voluntary motherhood to come into the agenda for women's rights, and particularly for the ERA. She sort of privileged commitment to the ERA over a whole range of other policy issues that were very important to women at the time. And I think these kinds of things made it difficult to create the large-scale coalition of women behind the ERA when it was initially introduced in the 1920s and 1930s.
Do you think, Julie? Yeah, do you think, Julie, that we have that coalition now? Are you optimistic about 2021, let's say?
So I am optimistic about it, largely because I think that it's not just women, but women and men from a variety of political ideologies that support the ERA today. It really is a principle that even Ronald Reagan in the early 70s described as morally unassailable. I think we'll always have debates about what the ERA means, in much the same way we continue to have debates about what the Equal Protection Clause means. There are things that in the 1970s legislative record and the legislative history of the ratification now that really anchor the ERA's meaning in a manner that I think is extremely inclusive. We have evidence in the recent legislative history, including the floor speeches of Danica Roem, the first transgender legislator in Virginia, that really point to the inclusiveness of the ERA. We have the leadership by women of color both in the 1970s as well as today that point to the importance of women of color and their concerns in the Equal Rights Amendment. So I do believe that we've come a very long way, and it's been a lot of hard work in building coalitions to create a very inclusive ERA. So I am much more hopeful that we're at a point in history where that's possible.
Well, Julie Suk, thank you so much. And thank you so much for the book. I recommend it to everyone. A lot of the women and men who were left out of the story of the ERA in the general telling of it are pinpointed and raised up by Julie Suk in her book. Thanks so much, Julie.
Thank you, Carol. It's been a pleasure.